This is going to be pretty straightforward, just essentially exactly as I have it up here. I do need to credit someone, and I will when I get to the particular point. For a lot of this material, I'm not a historian by training, and this is going to be largely historical. I'm basically a text person, although I have one degree in ancient history, but it's not my real focus. But I think I'll be able to communicate some good material from a friend of mine who was gracious enough to allow me to use it. The focus here again are some statements to begin in the DaVinci Code about the Council of Nicaea. Again, drawing from the dialogue, Teebing says, Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea. Sophie says, hold on, you're saying Jesus' divinity was the result of a vote? A relatively close vote at that, Teebing added. Well, we'll see. Other assertions about Nicaea in the DaVinci Code. One was, you'll get a very strong feeling that the council was controlled by Constantine. Very hard to read the book and not come away with that impression. Second, that Constantine never truly converted to Christianity, but was a lifelong pagan. That is something that the book makes a point of. Third, that the council, under orders from Constantine, dictated which books got into the New Testament. This is more heavily put forth by Brown's sources, but it is suggested in the book, so I'll include it. Fourth, the idea of Jesus' deity was invented by Constantine in relation to the outcome of this council. 5, Jesus' deity was decided upon by a close vote. So these are the points of contention. And again, I do want to credit Dr. Ronald Heine, who was at the Puget Sound Christian College here in the local area, because a lot of this stuff is adapted for this presentation on this topic. He is an early church scholar. But let's just jump in here, since we've credited him. Constantine and the Christian faith. Constantine's conversion does get associated with an incident that happened at the Milvian Bridge in a battle near Rome against Maxentius, the emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Again, if you remember your world civ, the Roman Empire was divided into two portions. There was an east and a west, and at certain points they were both ruled over by emperors. There wasn't just one. Constantine had prayed for divine help against Maxentius and had seen some kind of vision in the sky. Again, we've probably heard this story, which he or his advisors interpreted as coming from the Christian God. We don't really know what it was, for sure. Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge appears to have influenced him toward a policy of favoring Christianity. Now, this much is pretty well agreed on by all parties. The real issue is what happens with Constantine afterwards. Does this have any lasting effect? Well, the DaVinci Code would say no. He didn't convert. He just went back to being a pagan and decided to use Christianity for political gain. And that's what we're here to question. Prior to Constantine's victory, Christianity had been an illegal religion. Christians were deprived of property rights, legal rights of assembly. They didn't have appeal in legal proceedings. And Constantine had been a worshiper of the sun god. This much is clear. The short-term results of Constantine's victory are that he did, in fact, maintain allegiance to the sun god. There's no evidence immediately that he had this really long-lasting conversion or even a dramatic conversion at all. However, despite the fact that he does continue this allegiance, and there's evidence from the coins to credit the sun god, he quickly began to grant privileges to Christians. He began to change Roman policy. Specifically, in February of 313, he met Licinius, the emperor of the eastern section of the Roman Empire in Milan, and they together issued what has become known, if you remember your history of civ again, as the Edict of Milan. He also began giving large gifts to the church and favoring Christian clergy. So there is some sort of change, some sort of impact, not what you'd really call a long-lasting or profound conversion, because he's also maintaining loyalty to the sun god. The Edict of Milan, 313, was not just aimed exclusively at Christians. It was an edict of toleration for all religions. Our purpose, the two of them, Constantine and Licinius, say at the beginning of the edict, and of course we have the edict, our purpose is to grant both the Christians and to all others full authority to follow whatever worship each person has desired. So it's an edict of toleration, just generally. Christians specifically are given legal rights in the edict, and it orders that all property that had been confiscated from Christians should be immediately returned without demand of payment. What about Constantine and Sunday? This is another claim in the DaVinci Code. And again, it's something that we're talking about it here because we're trying to follow a loosely chronological flow as Constantine's life touches on things that the Da Vinci Code claims. In 321, Constantine ordered that Sunday, the day on which Christians worship, would be kept free of legal proceedings. It used to be before he did this that Christians could be dragged into these legal proceedings on their day of worship, and if they objected, it's like, who cares? You're just a Christian. Constantine, passed legislation that prevented that from happening. The Da Vinci Code, though, is incorrect when it says that Constantine named the Christian day of worship Sunday in honor of the sun god, and also when it suggests that he changed the day on which Christians worship from Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, to Sunday. These are both claims made in the book. How do we know that's wrong? Well, the early church fathers, who were living and writing before Constantine was ever born, said this: on the day called Sunday, there's the Sunday, all who live in cities and in the country gather together to one place. This is Justin Martyr speaking again about Christians in his Apologia. Justin also says very clear that Christians did not observe the Sabbath. They worshipped on Sunday. In the letter of Barnabas, again mid-2nd century, the first day of the week on which Christians worshipped is referred to as the 8th day, to contrast it with the Sabbath. Again, these are all primary texts that basically show us that the Da Vinci Code's revelation is incorrect. Now, what about his real conversion? Or this is what I'm sort of terming his real conversion. Until 323, Constantine apparently maintained some sort of allegiance to the sun god. But there is evidence that at that time he began turning more completely to Christian God, to Jesus, and so on and so forth. In 323, Constantine faced Licinius, emperor of the eastern section of the empire. Again, he was a worshiper of the traditional Roman gods, so now they're fighting. Before they had been issuing a nice edict, and now they're enemies. The decisive battle between them took place on September 18th, 324, just 8 months before Nicaea. Constantine won the battle, became sole emperor, and there is evidence that this victory really prompted him to follow the Christian God. Now, this is from Eusebius's Life of Constantine. Eusebius was an ancient writer who recorded some of these events in early church history. The chapter there in Roman numerals, I believe, I hate Roman numerals, 55, I think. Quotation is long, but it's significant. And now I beseech thee, this is Constantine speaking. This is what's being recorded. I beseech thee, most mighty God, to be merciful and gracious to thine eastern nations, to thy people in these provinces, worn as they are by protracted miseries, and grant them healing through thy servant. Not without cause, O holy God, do I prefer this prayer to thee, the Lord of all. Under thy guidance I have devised and accomplished measures fraught with blessings. Preceded by thy sacred sign, he's alluding back to this thing he saw at the Milvian Bridge. I have led thy armies to victory, and still on each occasion of public danger I follow the same symbol of thy perfections while advancing to meet the foe. Therefore, I have dedicated to thy service a sole duty, tempered by love and fear, for thy name I truly love. While I regard with reverence the power of which thou hast given abundant proofs to the confirmation and increase of my faith, I hasten then to devote all my powers to the restoration of thy most holy dwelling place, which those profane and impious men have defiled by the contamination of violence. He continues in the next chapter, my own desire is for the common good of the world and the advantage of all mankind, that thy people should enjoy a life of peace and undisturbed concord. He goes on and on with this, and about a little under midway down, he says, only let men of sound judgment be assured of this, that those only can live a life of holiness and purity whom thou callest to a reliance upon thy holy laws. With regard to those who will hold themselves aloof from us, now catch that, he is grouping himself in one category, and he's going to distinguish himself from someone else. Those who withhold themselves aloof from us, let them have, if they please, their temples of lies. He is distinguishing himself here from pagans. He calls their temples of lies. He is switching allegiances. Next chapter. Truly our worship is no new or recent thing, but one which thou hast ordained for thine own due honor. From the time when, as we believe, this system of the universe was first established, and although mankind have deeply fallen and have been seduced by manifold errors, yet, catch the quote, yet hast thou revealed a pure light in the person of thy Son. He is clearly not aligning himself with pagans at this point. They worship in the temple of lies. They don't do what we do, us, them. This is much stronger than it had been up to this point. What about Constantine's deathbed baptism? The DaVinci Code asserts that Constantine was not baptized until he was near death and too frail to prevent it from being done. Tebing says that. According to Eusebius's Life of Constantine, there you have the reference, Constantine postponed baptism until he was near death. That is true. But there's no evidence that it was done against his will. In other words, he's not like fighting against it. That has to be inserted into the account. Delaying baptism was actually not an uncommon thing in the early church. The fathers didn't like it, but it was actually pretty common. As late as the 5th century, baptism was often postponed to avoid the responsibilities it incurred, basically spiritual laziness. Public proclamation, if I do this, then certain things are going to be expected of me, and I don't know if I really want to go through with that. And Constantine was apparently one of those. In the late 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa preached a sermon called Against Those Who Put Off Baptism. So this was a big enough problem that Gregory, devotes a whole written sermon to it that, of course, gets circulated. Council of Nicaea. The DaVinci Code asserts that the idea that Jesus was God cannot be found prior to Nicaea. We've dealt with that in Session 5. Primary source material from the early fathers also illustrates the error of the DaVinci Code and Brown's sources and sets the stage for what Nicaea was really about. It was well known by the 2nd century AD that Christians considered Jesus to be divine far more than a man. We get this from pagans. There is pagan testimony to the fact that Christians worship Jesus as God well before the time of Constantine. This is from Pliny the Younger to the Emperor Trajan, 1st decade of the 2nd century AD. Pliny writes, again in his letter, meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second time and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, so on and so forth. Because they were Romans, I couldn't kill them. Remember Paul, this actually saves Paul's life in the book of Acts, the fact that he's a Roman citizen. It's alluded to right here. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God. This is a pagan source, Pliny. We get it from early Christians as well. I'm only going to give you 2 examples here. In a sermon, 3 examples actually. A sermon or a homily called 2nd Clement, chapter 1, verse 1, which dates from the middle of the 2nd century, begins this way. Brethren, we must think of Jesus Christ as of God. Ignatius refers in one of his letters to Jesus Christ, our God, specifically his letter to the Ephesians. And he says in another place, I glorify Jesus Christ, the God who has given you wisdom. It's his letter to Smyrna. This is 125, 150 years before Constantine. We've already seen textually, when it comes to the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, this is what the Scriptures taught. This is the position that manifested itself very early as orthodoxy, but it wasn't the only way that people looked at it because it's a tough issue. Now, I'm going to refer you to the writings of Larry Hurtado. I know Larry. Larry and I have corresponded a bit. He teaches at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He's an American. Very nice guy. His tradition is the Assemblies of God, but he's not that anymore. He would still call himself a Christian. He wouldn't like conservative labels that the Americans use. Hurtado has done a truckload of work in this area. Specifically, he has devoted his scholarly expertise to 2 areas. One is papyrus study. The other is to the early worship of Jesus. If you want a book that is cluttered, chock full of primary source references for the early worship of Jesus as God, this is where you go. Larry is also one of one of the scholars I know who's read my dissertation. We go back and forth on that. I've gotten him to change his mind over a couple things, but I'm still working on one or two. I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I give him a little ribbing there. But he's a wonderful guy, just does great work. And if you want primary source material, he's the guy. That's where you should go. The struggle that led to Nicaea, how to articulate Jesus as a divine being. This is the problem. You know, we see the text, we see these passages. I took you through a number of them before, and it's like, well, how do we put this into words? How do we express, you know, a father and a son who are both Yahweh? And how do we be monotheists while we're doing that? And what about when one prays to the other? And the whole thing about becoming a man. I mean, this is mind-bending stuff. The texts themselves, if you really look at them closely, now that you've been exposed to them, there are a number of texts that are fairly clear that there's some two-ness going on here. But the problem was how to articulate that. What does that mean? That was tough. So what did the scriptures teach in this regard? The first view, and this is the view that was the dominant view. It's the view that has become recognized as orthodoxy. It's the view that was recognized as the majority Orthodox opinion before Nicaea, and the one that will win the day at the end of the council. This view was that Jesus and God the Father were the same in essence. Both had therefore always existed. That's a key element. However, they were distinct persons. View number one. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but there was discussion both in Jewish writings, Philo, his discussion of Logos, and New Testament passages, that the Logos was, again, the second deity entity. And the question was, chronologically, where does the Logos come from? Did the Logos have a beginning? Or was the Logos always with God and God just brought the Logos forth? This view said he was always there and God brought him forth. Other views said he came into existence at some point. View number two said Jesus was God the Father. Now catch the distinction. First view says Jesus and God the Father are the same in essence, but they're distinct persons. The second approach was just to say, well, Jesus is just the Father. He is the Father. The Son is the Father. Now the problem with that became known as modalistic monarchianism, was that it raised some difficult points. Middle paragraph. The view solved the problem of worshiping God and Jesus. Hey, they're the same guy. No problem there. You were worshiping only one God because Jesus was God the Father. However, it created other problems. If Jesus were God the Father, then God the Father suffered and died on the cross. I mean, how can you have that happen if it's the same being? Totally. How can he lay dead in a grave for 3 days? How could that be? To whom did Jesus pray? I mean, is Jesus praying to himself then? So it just created problems, and it was not accepted, but it was around prior to Nicaea. View number three said Jesus was not God. He was also not man. He was something in between. Jesus was a human being like all other human beings, except that he had been born of a virgin. Because Jesus was a very religious man, he was chosen by God, and a special power called Christ descended on him. Two variations. One would lean to saying, well, he was just a man, but then he was like indwelled by this Christ thing. The other one would say, and this gets closer to Gnosticism, that the heavenly Jesus manifested himself as an earthly Jesus. So kind of a man, but not, that just this trying to wrap their minds around this position. But he definitely wasn't God in the same essence. He definitely wasn't the Father. He definitely wasn't the same essence. He was something different. Again, this is close to Gnosticism. The view was actually called Docetism, though. Docetism taught that Jesus did not have a real human body. It only looked like he was human. He only appeared as a human. He wasn't really incarnated. Again, this view was more of a denial of the humanity of Christ, and it gets close to the Gnostic view. Now, along came an important figure, Arius of Alexander, who became a focal point in the struggle to articulate all this. How to assert that Jesus was God and worship him and still claim monotheism. Arius was a presbyter in Alexandria, Egypt, under the jurisdiction of Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria. Sometime before 318, Alexander began to dispute what Arius was teaching about Christ, and he called a synod to discuss the matter, and the synod condemned Arius. That synod was not Nicaea, something that happened earlier. because Alexander was a little concerned about his understudy here. Arius' writings have not been preserved, but a few things have been preserved in the writings of the church fathers who wrote against him. Athanasius quotes a creed that Arius and his followers sent to the bishop Alexander. And an excerpt here, this is Arius' position. We recognize one God who alone is unbegotten, eternal, without beginning, true, immortal, wise, good, sovereign, judge of all, governor, administrator, unchangeable and unalterable, just and good. Lots of adjectives there. He is God of the law, the prophets, and the New Testament. He has begotten an only begotten Son before eternal times. That's an odd phrase. How can eternity have time? Before eternal times, through whom also he has made the ages and the universe. The Son was begotten, not in appearance. So that Arius is denying a Gnostic element here. Catch that. Son was begotten not in appearance, but in truth, and exists unchangeable and unalterable by his own will, a perfect creature of God. He is a created thing, but not as one of the other creatures begotten, but not as one of the other begotten beings. He's trying to say that this one was somehow unique, somehow different. He was created by the will of God before all times and ages, and has received both his life and being from the Father. The Father is the source of all things, but the Son, who was begotten by the Father apart from time and was created and founded before the ages, did not exist before he was begotten. This becomes the key point. Okay, Arius is saying that the Son had a definite beginning before which he did not exist. The Orthodox position, view number 1, said, he is the essence of Yahweh, and Yahweh has always existed, therefore he has always existed as well. That becomes a crucial matter. He was begotten apart from time before all alone was made to exist by the Father, for he is not eternal, nor co-eternal, nor co-unbegotten with the Father. Arius, very clear, but you got to look at this and you say, the Son is not an ordinary guy. He's something very special. He's not quite what view number 1 says. This becomes the debate. So Brown and his sources blunder here when they insinuate that the Arian view was that Christ was a mortal man like any other man. Arius did not believe nor teach that Christ was just like any other man, neither did the Gnostics. For Arius, while the Son was a created being, he is the first and highest of all God's creations, the being who created the rest of creation. Arius' bishop, Alexander, believed, like Arius, that the primary distinction between the Father and the Son was that the Father was unbegotten, but the Son begotten. Unlike Arius, though, Alexander believed the Son had always existed and was merely brought forth by the Father. And so this created some friction, and it led to this synod that Alexander called. The synod condemned Arius, but it didn't really stop anything because they had to have the Council of Nicaea. Now, what happened here? There are no surviving minutes or records or acts of the council that were taken while it was happening. There are some primary sources, though, so that we know, not completely, but to a large degree what happened. There was the Creed with the list of those who signed it. That has survived. The Nicene Creed, you've probably all read it or recited it before, and the list of those who signed it. 20 canons or rules which the bishops passed. By the way, none of them have Constantine or the council deciding on which books get in the New Testament. That is a complete fabrication in the DaVinci Code. Nicaea had nothing to do with that. Nowhere shows up in any of the canons. The synodal letter sent out to the churches telling them that the council was going to be held, that has survived. Later letters written by Eusebius and Athanasius, who were present at the time. Eusebius was a bishop of Caesarea and a voting member. Athanasius was basically just a secretary, but he turns out to be a pivotal figure in the whole proceeding. It is unknown exactly how many bishops attended the council. Sources differ in the numbers given. Eustathius of Antioch says about 270 attended. Eusebius says 250. Athanasius first says 300, and in a later piece of writing, 318. The number 318 is probably mythological because it's based on Genesis 14:14. So scholars kind of look at 318 and say, he's being poetic or allegorical here. Basically, somewhere between 250 and 300. That's how many were there. The council opened with a speech by Constantine in which he pleaded with the bishops to establish peace among themselves. The extent of Constantine's participation in the debates themselves is unknown. Eusebius tends to put more emphasis on Constantine's involvement than Constantine does in his own letters related to the council. And there's a source, if you want to go look up those letters, see what they say. You can check them out. It was very obvious that the overwhelming weight of opinion was against Arius and his views. The majority view was view number 1, noted before, that Jesus and God were the same essence, both eternal and uncreated, and were distinct persons. Now, Eusebius was sympathetic to Arius' view but couldn't support it. He didn't really want him kicked out of his position. So Eusebius and others proposed a creed which was used in Eusebius' church later on. This was a scriptural creed, basically drawing its language from Bible verses, which agreed with the traditions and confessions of faith in all the churches. Everyone could have signed this creed. Everyone at the council, including Arius, could have signed this creed. We have this creed from Eusebius. Everyone could have done it, but it wouldn't have solved the problem. They would have just had to have another council. And so this creed did not work. It was adopted by the bishops at Nicaea, or the creed that was finally adopted by the bishops of Nicaea was a different one. So they say, nice idea, Eusebius. We appreciate the spirit in which you've recommended this creed, but it's just not going to solve the problem. We don't want to have to meet again, and so they voted it down. Now, the creed they produced, they put language in it to ensure that Arius would either have to change his position or would not be able to sign it, because that was the issue. The non-scriptural word was inserted as the centerpiece of the creed. It was the word homoousios, which means of the same substance. This word replaced homoiousios in the other creed, which meant of similar substance. Arius could have signed that one. He could not have signed homoousios, of the Father and the Son were of the same essence. Okay, so they changed that word. It's kind of interesting. If you look at the word, there's only one letter difference. One letter made all the difference in the world as far as the council was concerned. The creed, therefore, asserted that the Son was of the same essence as the Father. Athanasius wrote that the bishops wanted to express their faith in scriptural language, but the Arians kept twisting the words of Scripture so they would support their own views. So they abandoned trying to have every line of the creed come out of a verse, and they said, look, we're going to have to put extra biblical language in this thing to make sure it articulates what we're saying, and so that Arius will either have to change his view or just not sign it. And so that's what they did. The creed also defines the Son as begotten and not made. Now, remember when Tebing said, yes, the deity of Christ was decided upon by a vote, and a very close vote indeed. Yeah, 2 or 3 of the bishops that we know were there didn't sign it. Remember, there were between 250 and 300 there. That is not a close vote. What, 248 to 2? It's just not a close vote. It's I don't know how else to say it. It's just disinformation at that level, in that part of it, that part of the book. Constantine in the New Testament. The Council of Nicaea in and of itself had nothing to do with determining which books got in the New Testament. Again, none of the canons even mention this. The assertion that Constantine had a hand in the determination of what Gospels or New Testament books the church was to use is actually based, when I say it's based on this letter, trust me, if you read Bagent and Lee and these other people, they're gonna link it to Constantine, for which there's no evidence. There is a letter in another context where Constantine writes to Eusebius, and in the letter, Constantine says that the large numbers of people in Constantinople, the capital, were becoming Christians, and he wanted the number of churches there to be multiplied. I want to start some other churches, he says. To meet the need of this expansion of churches in the city, Constantine asked Eusebius to prepare 50 copies of Scripture to be used, quote, for the instruction of the church. The only specific instructions Constantine gives Eusebius, and again we have the letter, for these copies is that they, quote, be written on prepared parchment in a legible manner and in a convenient portable form by professional transcribers thoroughly practiced in their art, unquote. The rest of the letter deals with issues of payment for the materials and the delivery of the copies. The emperor asked that the copies be delivered to himself for his personal inspection upon completion. He never says, these are the books that you need to put in, or these are the books that you need to take out. He never says it. And as we did in session, I believe it was number 2, we talked about early witnesses, early lists of the canonical books. The claim that Constantine fiddles with and fixes the canon is just false. There is no primary source evidence for that view. It just doesn't exist. Now, again, to summarize, that's all I want to cover about Constantine. This one was a little bit shorter. Constantine was involved at Nicaea. We don't know the extent. It had nothing to do with fixing the books of the canon. The issue was about how to declare what the majority view had already formulated, had already adopted as the correct view of how to view Jesus' relation to the Father. They could see the passages that I gave you in the last session where you have a Godhead. They linked that to Jesus as the Son. The difficulty was, how do we express that? How do we talk about two persons, same Yahweh, but two Yahwehs, same essence, Father, Son language, and be monotheists? How do we get that down and express it in a formulaic way so that we don't have to keep fighting over this issue? And so they met with Nicaea to specifically discuss with Arius. Arius never produced anything that convinced more than 2 or 3 people that he was right. He was outvoted at least 248 to 2. It was not a close vote. Any questions? Okay, seeing none, let's take a few minutes and we will come back for number 7. Okay, number 7 session for today. This is one I just wanted to have a little bit of fun with, and it's designed to be a little shorter. The conspiratorial logic of the DaVinci Code and Jesus' bloodline theorists. Up until this point, it's been a lot of nuts and bolts, a lot of this text says this text says that. And again, my style is, I know it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but I try to give you the primary sources, give you good secondary sources so that you can check up on me. I'm not making it up. Just go and look. That's what we're all supposed to do. For this one, though, I wanted something. When I sat down and I thought about this, I wanted something that would be a little lighter, but I think equally important, and that is to talk a little bit about what you, the reader, the recipient of Dan Brown's work, and especially his sources again, Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln, and of course, Picknett and Prince and other writers, what are they asking you to believe? When it really comes down to it, how are they asking your mind to work? And I want to go through and make a few logic statements that illustrate to you what you really have to believe. How do you really have to think to accept what they're giving you? And I've titled it Conspiratorial Logic of the DaVinci Code, or How Finding People in the Publishing Industry Who Can't Think Critically Will Pave Your Way to a Bestseller, or How Speaking in a British Accent Masks Non-Sequitur Arguments. And that is particularly aimed at Michael Bagent, again, not Dan Brown. Bagent is, I think, the leading person in here who really tries to put one over on us. Of course, this is not Michael Bagent, Henry Lincoln, and Richard Lee. Frankly, we would do better with the Lone Gunman. But I want to take a look at what they do and consider it all as one big non sequitur. What is a non sequitur? Latin, of course, it means it does not follow, a statement that does not logically follow from what preceded it. Or put another way, a conclusion that does not follow from the preceding premises. And let's go through a few examples. Here's what they want you to accept. Ask yourself, for all of these, does this make sense? If a document is old, it must be true. Is that true? Oh, but we were told right here on the front cover, the discovery of the Gospel of Judas is astonishing. This will change the way we all look at Christianity. Now, to say that of course, in respect to the Gospel of Judas, what they really are saying is that since we found this new gospel that's really old, and of course it's not as old as the New Testament, but we found it, so that gives it validity. It's just not logical. If a newly discovered document disagrees with previously known documents, it must be true. Does that make any sense? This is what they're saying, though. The Nag Hammadi material disagreed with the New Testament material. The Nag Hammadi stuff must be right. It contains the truth. It contains the unaltered story. What they're really saying when they say that is this: if a newly discovered document disagrees with the ones we know before, must be true. Documents which exist in only a few copies must have been suppressed. Well, there aren't many of these Nag Hammadi Gospels, or there's only one of the Gospel of Judas, or it took us this long to find it. That's proof that the evil Orthodox Church must have been suppressing and destroying all these other ones. Does that make any sense? Must that necessarily and logically follow? No, it is a non sequitur. By the way, exploring that logic, Herodotus, the history, Thucydides, look how many copies. 8, 7. Here we get down to 1 partial, 19 for Livy, 20 for Tacitus, Pliny, 7. This is an old figure now. The New Testament's pushing 6,000 now. But the point, of course, is that there's no evidence that if something like Plato only exists in 7 copies, that anyone was out there destroying the other ones. It's a non sequitur. It does not follow. It is not coherent thinking. If document A and document B are about the same person, the document farthest removed from that person's time must be true. Well, the New Testament Gospels and the Nag Hammadi Gospels are about Jesus, and the Nag Hammadi Gospels are older, but those are the ones that are true. Again, does it make any sense? Does it necessarily follow? No. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to reduce their claims to just simple propositions, that you can see the illogic and the muddled thinking that must be embraced to think this way, the way they want you to think. If the content of a document about a religious issue is controversial, it must be true. The Gospel of Judas will change everything. They're implying, of course, that that's the real one. Why? Because, well, it doesn't say what all the other ones say, and it's really controversial. That must be the truth. It must have just been suppressed. Come on. The opinion of the majority in a religious issue must be wrong and must have been arrived at in a power struggle. I mean, it's just inconceivable that a lot of people, the majority, could have actually agreed peaceably. And that's how the majority formed. Why is that inconceivable? Again, if you accept the conspiratorial thinking, this is what you're asked to affirm. If one person who believes something behaves badly, then most or even all of the people who share that belief would approve of that behavior or behave the same way. Well, we know that there were early church fathers, early Christians, who didn't have nice things to say about the role of women. That must mean that most Christians think that way, and that this characterizes the church. That must mean that Gnosticism, is just the way to go, because they had so much of a more enlightened view. Just because one person thinks one thing and that one person is a member of a group does not mean that everyone else in the group thinks the same thing. How simple and elementary can it be? But this is what you're asked to believe. You're asked to swallow this. A person or group of persons who behave badly can't be correct, especially when it comes to religious truth. So what we're saying here is that we can judge the veracity of an idea by virtue of the way a person behaves. Is that necessarily true? No. He or she could just be a dork. But the dork might actually be right on whatever given issue it is. Okay? We all know dorky people who get things right. You and I might be among them. I can speak with authority on this one. Anyone who opposes an idea has an axe to grind. There can't be any substance to what he or she is saying. So if I object to the idea, let's say, that the Nag Hammadi Gospels are unaltered truth, if I object to that, I must have an axe to grind. I really can't be saying that because of historical records and circumstances. Surely, the majority view, the Orthodox, Christians, surely they had an axe to grind, and that's why things turned out the way they did. Again, this is so clearly incoherent, but this is exactly what you're asked to believe. People in power cannot be trusted when they say something is true. Therefore, people not in power can be trusted when they say something is true. Right? Well, I'm sure we all know this by life experience, don't we? It's just silly. How about this one? God approves of everything in the Bible. Does he? Aren't there bad things recorded in the Bible? Well, of course. Does that mean God approves of everything? Or is it just describing the way things are or the way things were? Does it have to have some blessing pronounced upon it just because it's in the Bible? No. Everything in the Bible is prescriptive, they want us to believe. That means it's prescribed, it's doctrine, it's the way you ought to think. Nothing in the Bible can be just describing things. No, we can't have that. Frankly, all this charge of patriarchal culture needs to be adjusted just a little bit, because in many cases, descriptions of patriarchal culture in the Bible are just that. They are descriptions. This is the way people lived. This is the way people thought. It is not laid down as, thus says the Lord, you should look at a woman this way. And again, I'm not saying that the Old or New Testament is the 20th century or the 21st century. I'm not saying that at all. I will say it's better than that it has been characterized by the DaVinci Code crowd, and that this kind of logic is what is driving a lot of their criticism. If something hasn't happened in recorded history, it never happened. Put the resurrection in this one. Well, the only place that's written about is the New Testament. We're not going to count that. So since we're not going to count that, there's no record of anything else like that, so it must never have happened. Well, thanks. You've just claimed omniscience. I wish I was omniscient. Data and evidence are the same thing. See, data is something like the Gospel of Philip, this reference to Jesus kissing, whatever he kissed. That's a data point. That's a thing which exists that we need to study and think about. It's not evidence of any particular thing yet. That's why we have to think about it. It's just data, all right? Evidence and proof are the same thing, are they? Ask a lawyer. Evidence just is. It can be a physical object. It can be a statement. It can be an event. It doesn't constitute proof of anything. Evidence has to be put in context, and hopefully lots of data points and lots of evidence are put into the same context so that a picture emerges, so that we can draw a conclusion that is quote-unquote beyond a reasonable doubt, which means to draw any other conclusion, you'd look kind of stupid. That's all that means. But evidence and data and proof are not the same things. But if you read Bagent and Lee's and Lincoln's book, they think just because they've found a question or they found a statement somewhere in some book, they will often take it, rip it out, and show it to you in isolation and claim that the data point is now proof of what they want to argue. Meanwhile, they've excluded a whole lot of other data points that would give this one context. And we've seen that today, especially with the discussion on women, especially with the discussion on Jesus as a divine being, especially in relation to the discussion of the New Testament canon. They are notorious for this. Taking one data point, ripping it out, orphaning it, showing it to you, and pretending that it's proof to the exclusion of lots of other stuff. But this is the way that you're asked to think. If a field or discipline accepts something as fact, then it probably isn't true. And they probably have sinister reasons for taking that position. again, just real life demonstrates the silliness of the approach. Discovery of new information means that all old information is invalidated. This is what they want you to believe with respect to the Gospels and the manuscripts and all this. Again, what I'm trying to do is reduce their claims to the propositions that they want you to embrace. Discovery of new data means the new data is more reliable and factually trustworthy than the older data. On what grounds? Well, we just didn't know it before, so now we know something different, and that must be true. No one in ancient times wrote with an agenda. Only modern people do that. I could say no one in ancient times except the New Testament writers wrote with an agenda. Like the people who wrote the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Thomas, they didn't have an agenda. No. That would never have happened. All the Nag Hammadi material is agenda-free material. Just the facts. What bubble were those guys living in? No one with a minority viewpoint in ancient times ever wrote to take a shot at the majority opinion. Only modern people do that. Just a few quotes here that, again, to me, summarize the whole situation. Like I said, I wanted to have a little fun with this one. An education isn't how much you have committed to memory or even how much you know. It's being able to differentiate between what you do know and what you don't. That is an honest handling of evidence, an honest handling of material. That is the point of scholarship. Whether Brown sources like to hear it or not, this is what scholars are supposed to do, to try to determine what we can say and what we can't, and to put things really in probability scales. Men occasionally stumble over the truth, but most of them pick themselves up and hurry off as if nothing had happened. Churchill's just wonderful. This one kind of speaks for itself. Some of these writers, I will go as far to say that they probably know where the truth is and they want to avoid it because they don't want to stumble over it. Postmodernists believe that truth is myth and myth truth. This equation has its roots in pop psychology. The same people also believe that emotions are a form of reality. There used to be another name for this state of mind. It used to be called psychosis. Brad Holland is an artist. Don't know too much about him, but I thought this is pretty profound. And this one we have in our office. The work of scholars is not for sissies. Now, some of you are familiar with Donker. Donker is a famous lexicographer and Greek and early church historian. And frankly, I have this here because I really like the quote, because I get to look at it all the time. And also to say that if the sources behind what Brown is writing and perpetuating, again, he to me is not the bad guy. If these guys are not willing to do the grunt work and to look at the texts and give you all the data, they're not only sissies, they're axe-grinding sissies. Okay, this is not easy stuff. It is mind-numbing on occasion, but it's important. Just trying to give the data and be honest with it and think about it. Again, non sequitur, conclusion that does not follow from the preceding premises. Shakespeare's quote, I think, is a good way to wrap this up. An empty vessel makes the greatest sound. And I think that's what we have in this case. Just lacks substance that could be given to the public and still tell a really cool story. But there is apparently an agenda that is being propelled, at least at this point. And maybe it's as simple as, hey, I like being rich. Maybe it's something deeper than that. I don't know. Questions? I can move right into number 8. Go ahead.
I was listening to Gnosticism or whatever, and he had lectures on there by Dr. Haller.
Haller? Yeah. His intro to Gnosticism, by the way, is really good.
What I listened to.
He's a Gnostic, by the way.
But yes, yeah, I gathered that. One of the things that he said for my notes is there, I think there's inherent, and I can't fight it right off here, but there's an inherent necessity to rebel against law and structure and the laws like the Ten Commandments, Torah, because since it originated from an inferior being beyond,
Right.
that it's necessary for us to rebel against it because it is a means of repressing us. And that rebellion, if I have the right word, seems really to permeate all of the logic, it reminds me of the 70s when all the institutions banned. It just seems to be in every part of the literature. I hear quotes, of course, certainly have that.
No, I would agree. I think it's a rebellion against coherence, but that doesn't mean it's the desire to sound stupid. It's not that at all. It's that I know what I want to believe, and even if it's not coherent, I'm still going to believe it because I prefer it over this over here. And who knows why people make such choices? I mean, I'm willing to think that a lot of it, maybe is the church's fault. People are victimized in some way and they go another direction regardless of how silly the thinking process is that takes them there. But I tend to agree that a lot of it is just rebellion. I don't really know what motivates it. And I'm willing to say that, I don't really find myself too much as part of an institutionalized church. I mean, I go to a church that's in a denomination, but I frankly never think in those terms. I don't think that's what's important. I'm not here to perpetuate the livelihood of a particular denomination. But that being said, there is this sense of not wanting any sort of check and balance on thinking, and I don't know what else you'd call that. Bit away and string. Yeah, I think that there is an element of that for sure. Another question? Yes, Ted.
Back in Nicaea, those 300 people that were there, or 300 or so people, who were they? I mean, were they local, kings of the area, or
No, they were
cardinals and bishops?
Yeah, they were the bishops that were solicited. I mean, basically the call went out, all through the empire. We're going to have this council at Nicaea, XYZ date. You're invited to come. Some did, some didn't. But they're basically ecclesiastical people in various positions of the church. Yes.
There's some scholarship of a great deal of depth back on the early church in taking concepts that pretty much outface what's created the thought structure of today. What's happened to that type of scholarship and higher level of thought in our quote-unquote religious institutions in Ireland?
Yeah, I'm having one of these moments of what I should say and what I want to say. In an attempt to be nice, I think part of the problem is the only circles I can really speak for are what I have seen in Protestant evangelicalism. And I think that because for historical reasons, namely the late 19th century on, when you had the rise of Darwinism, and Darwinism as a school of thought permeated the institutions of higher learning and created what became known as the fundamentalist controversies and debates of the early 20th century, that produced an inherent or a systemic suspicion of higher education, because the universities were the places that were cranking out Darwinism. And it's not just Darwinism, but it's 19th century German philosophy and the things that worked well with a Darwinist scheme, a Darwinist perspective of reality. And the church was sort of blindsided by this and began to look at institutions of higher learning as these are just, intellectually speaking, dens of iniquity, and people who go off and get higher education come out corrupt and they don't believe the faith, and they're just really created an atmosphere of anti-intellectualism. that is still evident to some degree within what today would be called fundamentalism, even though I don't want to mischaracterize it, because fundamentalists tend to, they start their own institutions and they have PhDs like everybody else. But in the mid to early 20th century, you just started to get a very anti-intellectual tide within the church. That's one issue. The other issue, I think, being a little less nice, is just frankly laziness. We just seem, especially in our culture, to prefer being entertained over thinking. And a lot of what's in the culture reinforces that. It's the old nerd complex, where if you're not gonna go off and essentially, party and just really be alive to have fun, if you want to be serious, what's the problem with you, kind of thing. In the modern church, we just have instances where, I've actually had Christians come up to me and ask me why I've wasted my life studying the Bible. You're smart, Mike. You could have been a doctor or a lawyer. What are you doing this? You could have made a lot of money. I've actually had people tell me that and ask me that. There is an anti-intellectualism there. I think it's a worldliness that we tend to look at ourselves vocationally for how much money we can accumulate, how much wealth we can accumulate. We are too lazy to want to be intellectually stimulated because it's not going to lead to a profit, at least as we can perceive it. I think you have all sorts of forces that are intertwined and combine within the church to perpetuate an anti-intellectual stance. I'm trying not to make too sweeping of a generalization, because I know lots of Christians with PhDs in all sorts of fields that really care, about learning in sciences or humanities or whatever. But the lay community, people like you are the unusual ones. I hope you realize that. To me, having a lay person or someone who has maybe didn't go to grad school, just the average person, you get into adulthood and it's like, man, I want to learn lots of stuff. I just find it interesting. I'd rather go read this book than go watch American Idol. That's wonderful, to meet people like that. I've had grandmas in their 60s order my dissertation from my website. And they'll tell me, I don't know Hebrew or Greek, but I've read everything else on your website, and this is what's left. I wish we had more of that. But the reality is we don't. And I think it's because it's just not valued, because it's not a money thing. I think the church is just very worldly. I don't know any other way to say it. I think it's misplaced priorities. I think churches should make their pastors be theologians and hire theologians on staff. That's the way it used to be. Theologians aren't exciting, but the church rises or falls on their backs. Speaking outside of Providence now. But it's because of guys like Athanasius, attended the Council of Nicaea as a lowly secretary, that we have the Nicene Creed. Because he saw through the issues very clearly and articulated, said what needed to be said, because he had the intellectual bandwidth to do it. He wasn't alone by any means.
Having read quite a bit of the church fathers' writings, just in reading,
they're amazing guys.
How the thought process is like, they were
outside of serious Catholicism and maybe Anglicanism, the fathers have just been neglected everywhere. Now, I will say one thing and give credit to where credit's due. InterVarsity Press, which is predominantly selling books to the evangelical midstream, commentary, which is a book-by-book commentary from the church fathers on every book of the Bible. That plus the church fathers' writings themselves, I think, are a step in the right direction. We're sensitive to that too at Logos. We license InterVarsity stuff for electronic use. It's wonderful to be able to search it, because these guys were just, you'd probably have to replace any one of them with 3 or 4 other people now that have PhDs. They were just really amazing people.
MS were or any kind of evolution in the thought process doesn't stand up for you.
Yeah.
When you took the majority next to that, it just
I know guys who who do doctoral work in philosophical theology. You're doing a lot of stuff with the fathers there, but that's even rarer than a guy who goes into Semitic languages like me, because it's the old, well, if you go and study philosophy, all you're going to do is flip burgers or drive a cab. Never thinking that maybe we should send this guy to grad school to be a philosophical theologian and hire him on staff and have him actually write things for the lay audience so that they learn how to think again. I'm not naive enough to think that's going to happen, but that used to be the norm. Another question? Okay, well, let's break just a minute or two and do the last thing. Today is, I thought I would add something about the Gospel of Judas since this is current in the news, and I got the title from a friend of mine, work, Jumping the Shark, from the newsroom to the ivory tower, assessing the Gospel of Judas frenzy. And what I mean by that is, hey, practically everybody, even in the scholarly community, you have people who are just sort of getting swept up in the media frenzy, at least scholars who are media noticed, people like Elaine Pagels and Bart Ehrman, are just sort of exaggerating, not sort of, they are exaggerating the whole Gospel of Judas thing. And in my estimation, they have jumped the shark. If you're not familiar with the term, I'll say a little bit about it later. But let's just jump into what the Gospel of Judas is. If you've been on another planet over the last month or so, this is for you. Of course, the Gospel of Judas is a Gnostic Coptic document. The National Geographic Society put together a team once this document was recovered, and frankly, it has a very shady lineage when it comes to how people got it, how the National Geographic Society got a hold of it, who had it before then, and how did they get it and pass it around. But it is another one of these Gnostic Gospels that we're familiar with in other contexts, specifically Nag Hammadi. This is what the Gospel of Judas looked like as it was retrieved from the cardboard box in which it was kept. It actually was kept in cold storage for a while, according to the story, which really damaged it. It caused deterioration of the ink, and one of its owners thought that if you froze it, it would help it, but just didn't prove to be the case. So, you can see in this picture the ink leaching through from the other side and tattered there. About the project, in order to be certain of the age and its authenticity, the National Geographic Society, again, put it through a whole round of tests. If you go to the National Geographic Society website from which this is taken, you can view profiles of the contributors to the project, those guys who were on the team, which was kept secret for quite some time, to put it together physically, to translate it, and of course to try to deduce some meaning out of it. Profiles here on this page. I'm not reproducing all of these, of course. Some of these are familiar if you've read. Bart Ehrman publishes a lot on the popular seminary, semi-popular level. Bart teaches at NC State, I believe. This guy down here, the reason I have this page is I do want to draw your attention to Craig Evans. Craig teaches in Canada, the Acadia Divinity School in Nova Scotia. Again, I got to meet him last year, and just a wonderful guy. This is a picture of him. He was on, as I providentially found out, he was on this team and asked him to be a guest on Coast to Coast, and their producers thought it was a wonderful idea, and he did a good job. Notice what Craig says. This is an article from a newspaper called The Chronicle. It's a Canadian paper. Right here. Judas is a 2nd century Gnostic text, he said, referring to the Christian sect denounced as heretical by the church as early as 180 AD. It has an axe to grind, and it grinds it. Okay? He's very honest. Craig has authored over 50 books, authored or edited, I should say. One of the bigger names in New Testament studies, and Craig is he would be comfortable calling himself an evangelical scholar. Very, very well respected in the scholarly community. Let's face it, folks, you're not going to get on this team if you're a hack. Okay, this was a big deal to get selected here. Frequently asked questions. Now, I refer to you to the top one and the last one. You will see this term thrown around, Codex Chacos. The Codex is an ancient book consisting of folded pages and so on and so forth. It's called that because of this line right here. Is named after Demaratus Chacos, father of the Zurich-based antiquities dealer Frieda Nussberger. Now, Nussberger Chacos, you can get some description on these people. I don't know if I want to necessarily, I can't endorse necessarily the website, but there, if you put these names into a website, into a browser with Gospel of Judas, you're going to come across some websites that detail fairly explicitly how this thing changed hands. And this would make a good Robert Ludlum novel, because you have this thing spent a lot of time in the seedy underworld of the art and archaeology acquiring community. Basically those people who like to steal antiquities and pass them on. Now, this is from a blog on the Gospel of Judas, The Unsettling Conclusion. The Robinson contribution. Robinson here is James Robinson, the guy who was put in charge of translating the Nag Hammadi Gospels into English, forming that team. And it seems that Robinson has had some role to play in the surfacing of this gospel. Robinson used to be a Reformed evangelical Protestant pastor. He is now basically a Gnostic. I don't know him. I know a friend of his who used to be a colleague of his, in fact. And basically what Evans said of the Gospel of Judas, you can say of James Robinson. He has an axe to grind and he grinds it. You can look up his role in this on the web, going to this blog, Ekthesis. The lower page of this is about this fellow Farini in here, who is one of the central figures, it appears, with how the Gospel of Judas surfaced. It gets kind of bizarre, because the current state of this is that this codex actually contained 4 books. The Gospel of Judas was one of them. There are 3 other books, portions of which are in this codex. That means that there's a question to be answered. Does Mr. Farini still retain the missing parts of the codex? If so, how much? There have been things in the recent past that have appeared on eBay associated with Mr. Farini that some suspect might be part of this codex, believe it or not. It's like everything winds up on eBay. But this, if you're going to follow the Gospel of Judas story, this is a figure that you should keep your eye on. And if you go to the New Testament blogs, there are several good ones. They will keep you up to date on it. The Gospel of Judas, again, the mysterious case of Mr. Bruce Farini and others, just detailing, again, his relationship in this. I'm not going to spend too much time on this at all. Was the Gospel of Judas known to scholars? Well, the answer is yeah. Irenaeus mentions this. He doesn't quote from the Gospel of Judas. Irenaeus, writing in about 180 AD, mentions that there is this book that some have referred to as the Gospel of Judas. I put this here because this is a blog that one of my friends writes about jumping the shark. And my illustration here is this quotation right here. This is from Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is a scholar, New Testament studies, and this is the kind of thing that to me personally is a concern when it comes to the Gospel of Judas. How many of you have read the Gospel of Judas by now? Anybody? Okay, I have it up here on the screen. We can flip through parts of it. I'm not going to just read the whole thing. It's not that long. But they are really making much ado about, I won't say nothing, but next to nothing. And you have this quote by guys like Bart Ehrman. We aren't sure when this gospel was written. The copy in our possession appears to date from the end of the 3rd century, around 280 or so, 250 years after Jesus' death. But that doesn't tell us when the book was originally composed. In the case of the Gospel of Mark, for example, we don't have any surviving copies until after the 3rd century. But Mark, most likely the first of the canonical Gospels to be written, was almost certainly composed by 65 or 70. Do you see what he's just done? He's saying, well, Mark, we don't have copies of Mark until the 300s, and we know that was written around 65 or 70. Okay, there's our logical construct. Now we'll plug in, well, the Gospel of Judas is around 300, and maybe it works the same way. Maybe that's as old as the Gospel of Mark. It's just patently illogical. This is the kind of logic I was illustrating in the last session. And my friend here catches Bart on it. He says, "Holy non sequitur, Batman." One leaves the paragraph thinking that it's possible Judas was written at the same time Ehrman postulates for Mark, 65 or 70. He leaves the comparison to Mark hanging in the last sentence of the paragraph, seemingly implying, though not really, that Judas is similar. A careless reader could easily connect the lingering dots and think, well, if that happened with Mark, why not Judas? Ehrman's quotation comes from this book. If you don't have this, this is the one that the National Geographic Society is selling on their website. It's sort of the hurry-up version to get it out before the DaVinci Code movie. They're actually working on a more substantial book, a more academic book about the Gospel of Judas, but this is nice, light reading. And Ehrman has a chapter in this about, the meaning of the Gospel of Judas for Christianity. And he has this quote in there. And it's just very poor thinking. And when guys like Bart Ehrman come out with this will show up, and it has already showed up on lots of New Testament blogs, basically saying, come on, Bart, you just like the limelight too much. And it's drawing some negative publicity for Dr. Ehrman. Another example of a blog is the Gospel of Judas Troubling. This blog is called Ralph the Sacred River. It's kind of an odd, whimsical title. The originator is Edward Cook. Edward Cook is an Aramaic specialist who he might still be there at the Hebrew University in Cincinnati, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, but he writes here about the Gospel of Judas. And as far as I don't know if Edward Cook has any theological commitments at all. He says, all right, here we go. Sigh, with another Gnostic gospel alert. Now the publication today of the Gospel of Judas is providing tons of grist for the junk scholarship mill. Again, lots of scholars are just not buying that this is just this earth-shattering revelation. Here's what the New York Times has to say about this and other Gnostic gospels, and then he has the quote. And if you look at his comment down here, the utter inability of the New York Times to understand the import of this discovery is just amazing. I'm giving you quotations like this again just to make the point that the scholarly community, there are two communities. There's the scholarly community, the people who do this stuff, and they're frankly like, oh wow, this is cool, this is kind of interesting, but it's not earth-shattering. Then there's the group over here, the interested layperson who wants to find out about this, but the sources they use just aren't that great because they're using popular media sources, again, like the New York Times or People magazine or something like that. I mean, at least they're learning something, but the people who write those articles are not specialists. They're not even close to being specialists. And so most of the public is just getting bad information, which is a shame because my view is if the average person wants to know about this will get people talking about the New Testament, it'll get people talking about the Bible. This is in and of itself is a good thing. But boy, I wish they would get better information. And so the scholarly community has just not been kind to the media frenzy, but the popular audience is like, wow, this is just earth-shattering. Here is the Gospel of Judas. This is from the PDF translation that the National Geographic Society has on their page. You can download this for free. You can't download the book for free, but you can at least get the translation. Your title, your editorial team, your copyright notice. I don't know how much of this I really want to read. There are a few spots that are kind of interesting. Let's just go down here by the way, when it says scene, this is not in the text. This is just the way the editors have divided up the material. So down here, this is manuscript material. It says, one day Jesus was with his disciples in Judea, and he found them gathered together and seated in pious observance. When he approached his disciples, gathered together and seated, and offering a prayer of thanksgiving over the bread, he laughed. Jesus does a lot of laughing in the Gospel of Judas for some reason. The disciples said to him, Master, why are you laughing at our prayer of thanksgiving? We have done what is right. He answered and said to them, I'm not laughing at you. You are not doing this because of your own will, but because it is through this that your God will be praised. That's kind of an odd phrasing. Remember, think like a Gnostic. Think like a Gnostic. Who is their God? The disciples are Jewish? Who is their God? The demiurge. It's not Jesus' God. Jesus is an aeon. He's above the demiurge. So Jesus is actually very cutting in the Gospel of Judas to all the disciples. It's really very condescending in the way it reads, but you can get it for yourself and read it. They said, Master, you are the Son of our God. Jesus said to them, how do you know me? Truly I say to you, no generation of the people that are among you will know me. Throughout the whole thing, he's sort of flirting with them intellectually and just, you guys don't know squat. I mean, it's just very, it's almost mean in places. It's kind of unusual. Jesus speaks to Judas privately, knowing that Judas was reflecting upon something that was exalted. Let me go back up to this thing about Barbello. Let's see. Judas said to him, I know who you are and where you've come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbello, and I am not worthy to utter the name of the one who has sent you. Now, I'm going to park here just a second because this is another evidence that Jesus was more than a man from a Gnostic text. Barbello is Gnostic lingo for the ultimate God of the Pleroma. It's Gnostic scholars, Coptic scholars think that it comes from a Hebrew word which is be-arba el, which means in or with the four El. El was the name of the God of Israel. The four is the tetragrammaton, the divine name, the four letters. And so this is their way of referring to the ultimate God. They don't want to call him, in their mind, it's not Yahweh, even though they're using the four letters, because Yahweh is the fool, he's the chaotic, created monster thing from Sophia. They're using a lot of terminology you would be familiar with from your Old Testament, and they Gnostics like to use it of the ultimate God, who is the core of the Pleroma. So that's what the reference is there. But he says, you're from the immortal realm of Barbello, okay? You're from the Pleroma. You're one of these eons. Judas says, I know who you are. And of course, Jesus, gives him some cryptic response, but he also gives him some encouraging response later. Let's flip ahead here a little bit. You have here an interesting dream that the disciples have. Let's go back up here. At the very bottom, the disciples see the temple and discuss it. They have a dream. They said, we have seen a great house with a large altar in it and 12 men. They are the priests, we would say, at a name. And a crowd of people is waiting at that altar until the priest, and there's a gap, and receive the offerings. But we kept waiting. And Jesus said, what are the priests like? They said, some, and there's a gap, 2 weeks. Just the text doesn't survive. Some sacrifice their own children, others their wives, in praise and humility with each other. Some sleep with men. Some are involved in slaughter. Some commit a multitude of sins and deeds of lawlessness. And the men who stand before the altar invoke your name. And in all the deeds of their deficiency, the sacrifices are brought to completion. After they said this, they were quiet, for they were troubled. Jesus said to them, why are you troubled? Truly I say to you, all the priests who stand before that altar invoke my name. Again I say to you, my name has been written on this blank of the generations of the stars to the human generations. They have planted trees without fruit in my name in a shameful matter. Jesus said to them, those you have seen receiving the offerings at the altar, that's who you are. Now, I remember Craig saying on the show, and I've since read, this section, and it goes down below here, has a very anti-Semitic feel to it because it's very critical of Jewish offerings and the priesthood. And Jesus goes as far as to say, that's who you guys are. You're Jews. Again, this isn't the kind of flavor you get from one of the New Testament Gospels, but it's very typical of Gnosticism. Because why? Because the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Jew, is the demiurge. He's evil. He's the fool. He's Saklos, the blind one. He's the enemy because he doesn't want us to know that we have the spark of divinity in us. So they're very critical of Judaism. Jesus isn't a normal mortal Jew. He's an aeon that just kind of takes the appearance of a man. So Jesus can slam the Jews all he wants. He's not one of them. Again, this is Gnosticism. One of the things I hope you take away from, if you're just watching the DVD or you're here, don't be fed the line that Gnosticism is just this wonderful, enlightened thing, and boy, wouldn't we all be blessed if everybody was a Gnostic and all this kind of thing. And I'm not saying, Gnosticism's like any other faith. You can have people in it that just take it to the nth degree and use it abusively. A lot of Gnostics aren't going to do that. But what I encourage you to do is read the literature. It will tell you very clearly that this is not just option B or plan B or a little pretty much like Orthodox Christianity. It's not. There are significant differences. This is not just the flip side of a single coin. There are fundamental differences between Gnosticism and what we think of as Christianity. It grew out of Christianity, became an oppositional thing when it took on the form of a movement. There were reasons why the church fathers were troubled. I mean, how can you claim, to be a follower of Christ and say these things like, this is just the gospel of Judas. This is all through the Gnostic stuff. How can you say these things about God's people? This is where the church came from. Judas recounts a vision. Jesus responds. Let's go down to Judas asks about his own fate. Judas said, Master, could it be that my seed is under the control of the rulers? The seed in Gnostic thinking is the soul, by the way, his internal self. The rulers are the archons, the divide the watchers, I guess we would say in my lingo, Enoch lingo. Jesus answered and said to him, Come, that I, and then there's lines missing, but that you will grieve much when you will see the kingdom in all its generation. When he heard this, Judas said to him, What good is it that I have received it? For you have set me apart for that generation. Jesus answered and said, You will become the 13th. It's a reference to him being set aside from the apostolic 12. You will become the 13th, and you will be cursed by the other generations, and you will come to rule over them. In the last days they will curse your ascent to the holy generation. Generation here means the generation of the pleroma. The pleroma, the eons that were produced from the ultimate divine force. Jesus is saying, those other guys are not going to get to that level, but you will. It's very pro-Judas. It's the gospel of Judas. You will. You understand all these mysteries. Let's go to the last section here, the one that everybody's talking about in the media. Jesus speaks of those who are baptized and Judas's betrayal. Judas said to Jesus, Look, what will those who have been baptized in your name do? Jesus said, Truly I say to you, this baptism, gap, my name, another gap, about 9 lines missing. Truly I say to you, Judas, those who offer sacrifice to Saklos, gap, God, everything that is evil, again, it's just missing, it's not coherent. But then he says, but you will exceed all of them. Those who sacrifice to Saklos are, of course, the 12, the Jews there. You will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Again, in Gnostic theology, Jesus and the Christos, they're different eons, but the eon that becomes known as Jesus, there's the cosmic real Jesus up here who takes upon the appearance of a man. He's not incarnated. He's not really human. Okay? Gnostic theology varies from text to text. It's not consistent. He either appears as a man or he inhabits just some guy. But he's saying, look, Judas, you're going to hand over the man, who clothes me. I'm not really going to die because I'm an eon. I'm eternal. It's not going to happen to me. This is why Jesus and other Gnostic texts is just watching the crucifixion kind of chuckling. Boy, they think they got me, but they don't. Whereas Christianity, said this was a real man and he really died. The Gnostic texts also have Jesus rising from the dead too. It's completely contrary to what Lawrence Gardner and Michael Bajan and some of these other guys have. But again, they're not referring really necessarily to the man that was inhabited as they are to the survival, as it were, of the cosmic Jesus, who then appears to them again in human form. This is, again, a fundamental distinction between Orthodox Christianity and Gnosticism. This is why I said earlier, if anything, Gnostics do not downplay the divinity of Jesus, they downplay the humanity. And the DaVinci Code has it exactly reversed. It's just a fundamental error with understanding Gnosticism. This is why you have this. And of course, Jesus is saying, look, you're going to do this. This is your destiny. It's going to make you, it's going to vault you to the next level, the level of the generation of the eons. And then, of course, it ends where Judas just goes out and hands him over. Now, in the New Testament, it's very clear. In the book of Acts, we learn, specifically in Peter's sermon, that all of these things that happened to Jesus were the foreordained counsel of God. That's not new. The Gospel of Judas hints at that this was foreordained. That's nothing new with the New Testament. What's new, what's different about the Gospel of Judas is that Judas is nowhere called a traitor. Judas is not viewed negatively. Judas was a hero to certain Gnostic groups. Why? Why would Judas be a hero? He's fulfilling the will of God in that the Savior is going to be crucified, and Gnostics still believe Jesus is the key to salvation. But the real enemy is who? It's the God who sent him to the cross. Okay, it's this evil demiurge. Right? It's just something you have to realize. Gnosticism at this level, in this area, how they view God as the ultimate and the God of the Old Testament being two totally different things. If you're not used to reading Gnostic sources, it's kind of mind-bending. But when you approach the Gospel of Judas or one of these Gnostic texts, you have to keep the cosmology in mind, which is why we started with that. Here's the quote from from Irenaeus. Some declare that Cain derived his being from the power above, and acknowledge that Esau, Korah, the Sodomites, and all such persons are related to themselves. They declare that Judas the traitor was thoroughly acquainted with these things, and that he alone, knowing the truth as no others did, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. By him all things, both earthly and heavenly, were thus thrown into confusion. They produce a fictional history of this kind which they style the Gospel of Judas. This is 180 A.D. Irenaeus is referring to this gospel that now has been discovered and translated. Lastly, here's our anti-hero, or Michael Bagent, which, if there's anybody with an axe to grind, I think it's this fellow right here. I think he launched himself into his lawsuit of Dan Brown for purely publicity. I don't think he had a prayer, and I think he knew it, of winning the case, because he wanted to promote his new book called The Jesus Papers, which has now been released, exposing the greatest cover-up in history for a very reasonable $37.95. And I love this story. The dog ate my Jesus Papers. Bagent claimed in advance publicity that he had uncovered a document written by Jesus in the year 45 AD that proves he was alive. Okay. Well, if you actually get the book, if you're foolish enough to pay the $37.95, and you start reading it, this is what you find. Pretty soon, the reader realizes that there probably won't be any Jesus documents, that this book is really a private credo, an intimate declaration of belief dressed up to be the religious bombshell of the millennium. But then the long-anticipated appearance of the documents comes, or does it, near the end. Bagent meets with an unidentified antiquities dealer. This is kind of a formula for a movie. Who shows him two pieces of parchment. Each was about 18 inches long and 9 inches high. These were the letters from Jesus to the Sanhedrin. They existed. I was silent as I fully enjoyed the moment. Of course, he tells you later that he can't read Aramaic or Greek or Coptic. So it turns out that he has an antiquities dealer that he can't identify that tells him what's in these things that he never actually produces. That's the big bombshell of the millennium. I wished above all that I might have a familiarity with the ancient languages. Yeah, that would help. That would help. Comes in handy. It's like holding a treasure chest but not having the key to open it. And the final line is pretty much where it's at. The writer of the story says, this is just insulting. To have all this build up, to throw yourself in court, to basically sell books, and you come up and you produce nothing. You could have at least photocopied or taken a picture of these manuscripts. He's never going to do that. They probably don't even exist. Okay? He wants to make money off the conspiratorial logic. What a real scholar and a real researcher would do is you go to somebody like the National Geographic Society with deep pockets, you pony up for the manuscripts, and then you turn them over for scholarly study. You don't meet in a smoke-filled room and then tell us that you saw two scraps that were 9 by 18 and you couldn't read them. I mean, give us a break. But this is where he's at. And I think that it's just basically a fiasco. Now, having said that, the Gospel of Judas is valuable. I mean, you can learn things about it. It's a typical Gnostic text. We can at least learn something about the Gnostics. It's not surprising they held a positive view of Judas. We already knew that from Irenaeus. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us really not knowing too much more than what we knew before it was discovered. And for Elaine Pagels to put this quote on the cover of this book, "The discovery of the Gospel of Judas is astonishing." My question would be to Elaine, why? You act as if we've never discovered a manuscript before. We have like several hundred, or actually thousands of manuscripts, if we count fragmentary things. What's so astonishing about discovering a manuscript? What's so astonishing about discovering a manuscript that somebody in church history already told us existed? What's so astonishing about the contents of the manuscript being consistent with stuff we already knew about the Gnostic sect, specifically the Sethians, and their high view of Judas? Where's the revelation? But again, that just doesn't make for good copy. And, to me, that's pretty much where some of these people are at. Any questions? Yes, Guy.
Second is for DVD, define pseudepigrapha. But my question is this Gospel of Judas, does it claim to be written in the first person, or is Judas really asked out the question, kicks airtime, main character?
Yeah,
It's
not first person. It is what it is. Third person. It's about Judas. It doesn't claim to have been written firsthand by him. It doesn't. What we have of it ends. So whether this guy has more pages to it, if it goes in to describe the crucifixion or not, I mean, we don't know. There's lots of Gnostic texts that describe the crucifixion and a resurrection. So it's probably going to just be consistent with the rest of the Gnostic material if there is anything, left. I mean, who knows? That could be the end, though, for all we know. Pseudepigrapha as a term refers to Jewish and, in some cases, depending on the date, Christian books, or Jewish books that Christians went in and edited later, that were never considered part of the canon. Okay, they were never considered by Jews to be part of the Old Testament books. They were never considered by Christians to be part of the New Testament. They get their term, the term, contrary to what you'll see in some circles, does not mean false writings. It refers to the fact that the document claims to have been written by or about, usually about, a famous figure from the Old or New Testament. And so what is the pseudepigraph is the attribution of authorship that is not true. It's falsely attributed authorship, not that the contents are just bad and awful or anything like that. So that's where the description comes from. Another question? Yes.
How much National Geographic paid for?
I can only tell you what I've seen. They haven't been terribly forthright. I know that the asking price earlier was $2 to $3 million, but that was before National Geographic stepped in. That's the only actual figure I've seen, so I have to guess it would probably be that in that range. They've been a little tight-lipped about what they actually paid for it. The reason is pretty obvious, and scholars, this is a tough area because on the one hand, if it's kind of like a hostage situation. If you pay the price, it encourages people in the underground art and antiquities world to bring more things out and essentially hold the scholarly community hostage all over again. So if you meet the demand, then you're kind of hooked. And it's going to encourage more of the same behavior. The problem is if you don't meet the demand, scholars want to see this stuff. And frankly, even more than wanting to see it, they're concerned that this kind of material is just mishandled and it'll be destroyed and it'll be lost forever. And so there is a propensity. I'm not going to state a position here because frankly, I haven't thought too deeply about it. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I would be inclined to want something preserved, but I am concerned that it's just going to create a kind of hostage situation. This is still happening with the Dead Sea Scrolls, believe it or not. There are consistent rumors that there are still Dead Sea Scrolls out there, because when they were originally discovered, people aren't dumb. When they knew they could get money for them, they would take a scroll and slice pieces out of it, because they know they can sell it more than once. Just, you can call it greed. You could also call it, I guess, good business sense, from a black market perspective. But it encouraged that kind of behavior. And so that's the pickle you get yourself into.
Now, didn't I hear one? I read somewhere a short thing about this particular manuscript, and some of the people involved in obtaining it have a history of the kind of dealings you're talking about that are locked there for question.
Yeah,
is that true?
Yeah. If you go to the blogs, the names of those people will be given. There's one blog. It's not a blog. It's actually a website of a guy. I know I have his name in the file there. It's not coming to mind right away. If you put Gospel of Judas into a browser, and I could send you the specific address. There is a guy on the web that has a kind of a cheesy website. It looks like a 10-year-old put it together, but the guy's actually in the underground art world community, and he loves to make fun of the people who are doing these kinds of things, because he doesn't like the corruption in the underground art community. And he'll name names and he'll call them names too, and just poke fun at them constantly. And he has a lot of the Gospel of Judas stuff on his site, even before National Geographic ponied up whatever they did pony up. This guy was a friend of a guy named Charles Hedrick, who was a Coptic scholar who years ago got to see part of the Gospel of Judas and wrote out a very quick hand-drawn transcription and translation. And the guy has it on his website. Right? So he's saying, I'm a friend of Hedrick, and here's the proof, and here are the pictures that he took, and here's his translation. In other words, he's doing that to say that I'm not making it up. I know what I'm talking about here. I know these people. And he has lots of real kind of comical, but also sort of digs at some of these people involved, because they were extorting others. They were, trying to, I won't call it thievery, because they would get their hands on it and it would become a tool for extortion. But see, then you're caught in the middle, because how do I know if I'm a buyer, how do I know what I'm buying isn't stolen property from somebody else? And even part of it, they could be withholding parts, and I don't really get what I think I'm getting, because the people are unscrupulous. But it's kind of a funny site. If you email Guy or through Guy you get to me, I'll send you the site. It's interesting. And the blogs will have it too. The blogs know the site as well. If you go up to the New Testament blogs, like this one I had here in the presentation, or Paleo Judaica is a blog that's really devoted to antiquities and biblical studies. And New Testament Gateway, Mark Goodacre, who's a professor at Duke now, he has a pretty popular blog. But you can keep up with the Gospel of Judas saga by just keeping track of the blogs a little bit.
Earlier you said the Gnostics depiction Judas as a good guy. I know why you said that. And it even in like the movie Jesus Christ Superstar was shown in angelic attire and heaven at the end of it. What merit would you give, or why is the Christian academic community given to the idea that Judas really was a okay guy, filling purpose of God? Because you could say the same about Hitler, only in a Romans 8:28 way. But is there anything about Judas that actually is what's elevated?
Well, scholars are going to say what the data in the primary sources allow them to say, which is they're going to say, well, scholars will, if they're going to try to maintain some sort of religious neutrality or impression of neutrality, they're going to say, well, the New Testament characterizes Judas as a villain. The Gospel of Judas does not. Gnosticism does not. And that's pretty much where it's at. They won't take a position. But they will recognize that in terms of antiquity, the New Testament stuff is older and more closely related chronologically to the events that they describe. But, a lot of scholars they'll just leave it at that. The other side of that is there is no scholar though who would, even people like Pagels, who are just saying things basically to get media buzz. Even she's not going to say anything as silly and ridiculous as, this is, pardon the pun, this is the gospel truth, and Judas really was a good guy. I mean, she's going to stick with the data. This is what the Gnostics believed, and that's what it is when it is. Nobody's going to come out and favor a good guy Judas as being historically valid, because in their minds, frankly, they can't tell. They will admit that the New Testament stuff has priority, that it's chronologically preceding, that nobody else thought this way except for this. This is even a subsect of Gnosticism, the Sethians. So nobody's going to say that this was a dominant view held by anybody. Are we done?
I'll ask them there. We're pressing. Just on the topic of Judas himself, not so much the Gnostic gospel led. Have you ever seen a commentary suggesting it says that one of the 12 was a devil? Chris Ward, a few others side, but I think it's Matt Haber's commentary. Have you seen anything or have any belief that would indicate that Judas, the son of action, was a watcher? Idea not.
No, I've never seen that. I don't believe that. Everything seems to indicate he's just one of the guys, because other texts will say that Satan entered into him, so that would rule against the idea that Judas himself is some sort of non-human entity. Why would Satan have to enter into a deed? That doesn't make any sense.
But since you mentioned that, since you already said that Gnosticism, the serpent is
the serpent is the hero of Gnosticism.
In the Gnostic view, the fact that Satan entered into Judas props him up as all the work.
Right. He's empowered. He's enlightened. Well, from an Orthodox Christian perspective, he would be un-antichrist. Just someone who, in that sense, who would be oppositional. But I actually don't think that that's really a good way to look at Judas, because, Peter's sermon and there are other suggestions that Judas, it's the old, how can I be morally culpable if God engineered circumstances to do X, Y, or Z? And the fact of the matter is that the New Testament affirms both ideas, that God doesn't necessarily cause or control behavior, but circumstances can be arranged to take advantage of human propensities or whatnot, and God has the ability to take certain circumstances and steer them toward an end that he has ordained is necessary and needs to happen. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is the same thing. Was it Pharaoh who hardened his heart, or was it God? The scriptures say it was both. It's the old sovereignty, free will thing, and you could probably, if you stacked all the books that have been written on that, you're looking at skyscraper territory. It's not a new issue. I just tend to believe that if you don't have God being in charge of the crucifixion, in some sense, then somebody else had to be in charge. And who might that be? It doesn't cohere in either Old Testament or New Testament biblical theology. You can't have a competing, equally powerful being, even with divine plurality in the Old Testament, because the claim is that Yahweh created all the other ones. So by definition, they are derivative and inferior. What we think of as dualism is not very defensible in either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. So you have to have a sovereign God who is, in charge, so to speak. The real question is, how is he in charge? Does he cause people to do things? Is he behind people saying, sin, let me help you a little bit? Or has he foreseen what humans are going to do naturally because of the effect of the fall, and has engineered circumstances to a predetermined end? Does he predestinate at the beginning or at the end? It's another question. There's all sorts of questions, and when you get into this, and the answers don't fit into a good soundbite. No, no. Just thank everybody who came for coming, and those who get the DVD. Hope you enjoyed it. And thank you for listening. I enjoy doing it. Just, go out and demand the data. Demand that people who are telling you something show you where they got it so that you can go check it yourselves and do it. Invest some time into it.